They call it the strategic nightmare, the scenario that every war planner in the Pentagon has dreaded since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is the specter of the two front war. For decades, the United States has operated under the hubristic assumption that it possesses the omnipotence to dictate the security architecture of Europe while simultaneously tightening the noose around the neck of Asia. This was the luxury of the unipolar moment, a fleeting historical anomaly where Washington could act as the global sheriff, the judge, and the executioner without fear of reprisal. But that moment is dead. It did not die with a whimper. It is dying right now amidst the screeching of jet engines over the East China Sea and the silent, suffocating grip of a naval blockade tightening around Taiwan. We are witnessing the collapse of a grand illusion. The breaking reports that Chinese fighter jets have engaged in a hard radar lock painting Japanese aircraft as immediate hostile targets is not a mere diplomatic incident. It is a declaration. Combined with the intelligence confirming a soft blockade where Beijing is effectively filtering maritime traffic into Taiwan, the message to the collective West is unmistakable. The dragon is not just awake, it has realized that the eagle is distracted, exhausted, and bleeding out in the mud of Eastern Europe. I have warned about this inevitability for years. Empires do not crumble because they lack firepower. They crumble because they lack focus. They die of overstretch. The United States is currently pouring its industrial capacity, its intelligence resources, and its political capital into a proxy war against Russia. They have drained their stockpiles of artillery. They have exhausted their strategic petroleum reserves, and they have frayed the nerves of their domestic population. And it is precisely at this moment of maximum vulnerability that the second front has opened. This is not a coincidence. This is a coordinated geopolitical checkmate. To understand the gravity of this radar lock, one must strip away the sanitized language of the mainstream media. A radar lock is an act of war in all but name. It signifies that the pilot has acquired the target, the missile systems are armed, and the kill chain is complete. The only thing missing is the button press. By doing this to Japan, Washington's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Pacific, Beijing is demonstrating a terrifying confidence. They are daring the United States to respond. But with what? The carrier strike groups are overextended. The munitions are in Ukraine. The industrial base is rusted. However, to truly grasp the cynicism and the systemic hypocrisy at play here, we must look backward before we look forward. We must excavate the history that the establishment desperately wants you to forget. The outrage emanating from the State Department regarding China's actions in its own near abroad is a masterclass in double standards. Let us speak of the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, the United States unilaterally declared the entire Western Hemisphere, North and South America, as its exclusive sphere of influence. Any European power that dared to intervene in America's backyard would be met with war. For 2 centuries, Washington has toppled governments in Chile, Guatemala, Panama, and Grenada solely to enforce this doctrine. They nearly blew up the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Soviet Union dared to place military assets 90 miles from Florida. The United States understands perfectly the strategic necessity of a buffer zone. They understand that a great power cannot tolerate a hostile military alliance on its doorstep. Yet, when China seeks to secure its own coastline, when it seeks to prevent the encirclement of its territory by hostile U.S. military bases in Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea, it is branded as aggression. This is the intellectual dishonesty that underpins the current global order. The United States believes it has a divine right to security, a right to dominate the Caribbean and the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. But it denies that same right to every other civilization state. What we are seeing with the blockade of Taiwan and the pressure on Japan is China holding a mirror up to the West. They are applying the very same logic of the Monroe Doctrine to the South China Sea. They are saying if the Gulf of Mexico is an American lake, then the Taiwan Strait is a Chinese internal waterway. The establishment cannot process this because their worldview is built on the myth of American exceptionalism, the idea that the rules of history apply to everyone else but not to Washington. But reality has a way of shattering myths. The soft blockade creates a dilemma that no amount of rhetorical posturing can solve. By inspecting cargo, by delaying shipments, by effectively controlling the flow of goods without firing a shot, Beijing is demonstrating sovereignty. They are proving that Taiwan is not an independent entity protected by the magic shield of American power, but an island whose economic lifeline is held in Beijing's hand. This exposes the fundamental lie of the U.S. security guarantee. For decades, allies like Japan and Taiwan were promised that the American cavalry would always arrive. But look at the logistics. The U.S. military industrial complex is struggling to produce enough 155 millimeter shells for a land war in Europe. How exactly does it propose to fight a high intensity naval and air war in the Pacific simultaneously? The math does not work. The stockpiles do not exist. The ships are not there. The irony is suffocating. The very sanctions and economic warfare the West unleashed on Russia have driven Moscow and Beijing into a tight embrace, creating a unified Eurasian bloc that can coordinate these escalations. While Washington was busy lecturing the world on democracy and expanding NATO to Russia's borders, they forgot the oldest rule of strategy: never unite your enemies. Now, they face a synchronized pressure campaign on two ends of the Eurasian landmass. The radar lock on the Japanese jet was the sound of the trap snapping shut. The era of fighting one-sided wars against small, defenseless nations is over. The United States is now staring down the barrel of a conflict with a peer competitor who has studied the American playbook, learned from American mistakes, and is now using American overstretch to rewrite the map of the world. The empire is naked, and the cold winds of reality are starting to blow. This vulnerability is not just a matter of missing missiles. It is a systemic collapse of the economic and coercive weaponry that the United States has relied upon for a generation. For the past 30 years, whenever Washington encountered a problem it could not solve with a drone strike, it reached for the sanction button. The Department of the Treasury became as important as the Department of Defense. They believed that by weaponizing the US dollar, by controlling the SWIFT banking system, and by restricting access to Western technology, they could bring any nation to its knees without spilling a drop of American blood. It was the ultimate lazy man's imperialism conquest by spreadsheet. But the current crisis in the Taiwan Strait proves that this mechanism has suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. The engine of coercion has seized up when China locks radar on a Japanese jet, or when it squeezes the maritime traffic into Taiwan. It is doing so with the full knowledge that American economic threats are now hollow. Washington has already fired its biggest economic guns at Russia, and the result was not the collapse of the Russian economy, but the resilience of the ruble and the acceleration of a new global economic order. Beijing watched, took notes, and realized the paper tiger was made of printed fiat currency. The blockade of Taiwan acts as a terrifying mirror to American industrial decay. The establishment in Washington is currently in a state of quiet panic, not just because of the military implications, but because they have suddenly realized the extent of their own dependency. This is the irony of the century. The United States is threatening war to defend an island that holds the semiconductor chips essential for the United States' own military hardware, against the very nation that processes the rare earth minerals required to build those chips. It is a strategic suicide pact. The soft blockade is effective precisely because the global supply chain is not a democracy. It is a hierarchy of logistics, and China sits at the top of that hierarchy. While American politicians give speeches about decoupling and friendshoring, the reality on the ground and on the water is that the U.S. industrial base has been hollowed out by the very corporate greed they championed. They chased cheap labor in the East and left the American Rust Belt to rot, and now they are shocked to find that they lack the shipyards to repair their own navy and the factories to replenish their own munitions. We are witnessing the grand circumvention. This is the phase of history where the rest of the world stops listening to the West. The narrative management, the CNN headlines, and the State Department press briefings no longer hold power over the global South. Look at how the target nations are responding. They are not cowering, they are building alternatives. The West tried to cut off technology exports to stifle China's rise, assuming that without American intellectual property, Chinese innovation would wither and die. Instead, it forced China to pour billions into domestic research and development, achieving breakthroughs in chip manufacturing and aerospace that were supposed to be decades away. The barrier didn't stop them, it just made them faster. It made them self-reliant. By attempting to isolate the East, the United States has only succeeded in isolating itself. The emergence of the BRICS Plus alliance is a direct consequence of this overplayed hand. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and India are looking at the weaponization of the dollar against Russia and the threats against China, and they are moving their assets. They are trading in yuan. They are buying gold. They are circumventing the U.S. financial architecture because they see it for what it has become, a trap. This creates a palpable atmosphere of dread in the corridors of power in D.C. You can smell the fear and the frantic diplomatic missions, the desperate attempts to patch up alliances that are fraying at the seams. They know that if a shooting war starts in the Pacific, they cannot sanction China the way they sanctioned Russia. The Chinese economy is too big, too integrated, and too essential to the Western way of life. A total economic war with Beijing doesn't just hurt China. It evaporates the retirement accounts of the American middle class. It empties the shelves of Walmart, and it halts the production lines of Ford and General Motors. The soft blockade exposes this mutual assured economic destruction. China is effectively saying, we can endure pain. Can you? And the answer, whispered in the closed-door meetings of the Pentagon, is a resounding no. The American public, divided and weary, has no stomach for the inflation and scarcity that a conflict of this magnitude would trigger. The establishment knows this. They know their leverage is gone. They are shouting commands at a world that has stopped obeying, frantically pulling levers that are no longer connected to anything. The panicked response, we are seeing the hasty announcements of new task forces, the reshuffling of fleets that are overdue for maintenance, is the behavior of an empire that has lost the initiative. They are reacting, not leading. They are playing whack-a-mole with geopolitical crises. They try to plug the hole in Ukraine, and the dam bursts in the Middle East. They try to stabilize the Middle East, and the Pacific catches fire. This is not bad luck. This is the result of a system that believed it could force the world into a single mold, ignoring the history, culture, and security interests of ancient civilizations. They thought they could print their way out of debt and bomb their way out of defiance. But now, faced with a peer competitor who plays the long game, who understands the art of asymmetric pressure, the U.S. finds itself outmaneuvered. The radar lock was a signal sent not just to the pilot of that Japanese plane, but to the architects of American foreign policy. Your watch is ending. You cannot fight the geography. You cannot fight the math. And you certainly cannot fight the inevitable shift of the center of gravity from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But what is truly repulsive about this entire spectacle is not the strategic incompetence. It is the suffocating moral hypocrisy that coats every statement issuing from the State Department. We are subjected to a daily sermon about the sanctity of sovereignty, the inviolability of borders, and the sacred duty to defend democracy against autocracy. These words are spoken by the very same men and women who have spent the last 20 years turning the Middle East into a graveyard and North Africa into a slave market. They speak of the rules-based international order, a phrase that has become a euphemism for the rules we make and you obey. This moral posturing is the velvet glove that hides the iron fist of resource extraction and geopolitical domination. When Washington screams about the threat China poses to Taiwan, they are not concerned with the welfare of the Taiwanese people. If you doubt this, look at Ukraine. They claimed they were arming Ukraine to protect freedom. Instead, they have used the Ukrainian people as sacrificial pawns to weaken a geopolitical rival. Fighting to the last Ukrainian until the country is a demographic wasteland and a blackened ruin. They do not save nations, they consume them. We must look at the track record. This is not speculation, this is history written in blood. In 2003, they told us they had to invade Iraq to save the world from weapons of mass destruction and to plant the seeds of liberty in the Arab world. What was the harvest of that crusade? 1 million dead Iraqis, the complete disintegration of a functioning state, the looting of national treasures, and the birth of ISIS. They didn't bring democracy, they brought chaos so profound that it destabilized the entire region for a generation. Then they turned their benevolent gaze toward Libya. They invoked the responsibility to protect. They bombed the wealthiest nation in Africa back into the Stone Age, lynched its leader in the street, and laughed about it on national television. Today, Libya is not a democracy. It is a fractured hellscape where human beings are bought and sold in open-air slave markets. This is the legacy of American protection. This is what happens when the empire decides to help you. And now they are preparing to offer this same lethal assistance to the Pacific. The strategy is transparent to anyone who has eyes to see. They want to turn Taiwan into a porcupine, a poisoned chalice that will destroy China's military, even if it means the total incineration of the island itself. They are willing to see East Asia burn if it ensures that American hegemony remains the only structure standing in the ashes. The moral trap they have set for themselves is that the rest of the world has access to the internet. The global south remembers the drone strikes on wedding parties in Yemen. They remember the starvation sanctions on Syria. They remember the support for apartheid regimes when it suited American interests. The narrative of good versus evil is a fairy tale that no one believes anymore except perhaps the deluded pundits in the cable news studios of New York. This loss of moral authority is fatal. Power is not just about aircraft carriers, it is about legitimacy. When a superpower loses its legitimacy, it loses its ability to build coalitions. Why do you think the vast majority of the world, Africa, Latin America, most of Asia, refused to join the sanctions against Russia? It wasn't because they loved Putin, it was because they loathed the hypocrisy of the West. They see a United States that lectures them on human rights while arming genocides. They see a Europe that preaches about the environment while burning coal because they cut off their own gas supply. The moral trap creates a vacuum. When the United States frames the conflict with China as a battle for freedom, the global south looks at the ruins of Baghdad, the rubble of Gaza, and the chaos of Kabul, and they say, if this is your version of freedom, we want no part of it. The consequences of this coercion are coming home to roost. By weaponizing the financial system and militarizing human rights, the United States has forced the world to look for a new moral and legal architecture. The establishment fails to understand that their soft power, their movies, their culture, their political ideals has curdled into resentment. They are seen now as agents of instability. Every time they intervene, things get worse. Every time they promote democracy, a civil war breaks out. China offers a starkly different proposition. Trade without lectures, infrastructure without political conditions, and security without invasion. You may call it cynical, you may call it authoritarian, but to a developing nation that just wants to build a dam or a railway without being told how to run its internal courts, it looks like sanity. The panic in Washington regarding the soft blockade of Taiwan is the panic of a priest who realizes his congregation has stopped believing in God. They are shouting from the pulpit, threatening hellfire and damnation, but the pews are emptying. The radar lock on that Japanese jet was a physical manifestation of this rejection. It was a rejection of the American security umbrella, a rejection of the American definition of international waters, and a rejection of the moral hierarchy that places Washington at the top. The United States is trapped in its own rhetoric, committed to defending a world order that it destroyed with its own hands. They have sown the wind for decades, planting coups and sanctions and bombs across the globe. And now, in the swirling waters of the Pacific and the burning fields of Eastern Europe, they are finally reaping the whirlwind. This is the global reckoning, the inevitable moment where the physics of geopolitics asserts itself over the poetry of political rhetoric. We are now entering the phase of asymmetric warfare, a concept the Pentagon studies in theory but fails to comprehend in practice. For decades, American military doctrine has been predicated on shock and awe, overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and the ability to obliterate an enemy's command structure in the first 48 hours. But China and Russia have not spent the last 20 years building armies to fight the United States on American terms. They have studied the American way of war and designed a counter strategy based not on brute force, but on systemic strangulation. The radar lock on the Japanese aircraft is merely the kinetic tip of a much deeper, colder iceberg. The real war is being fought in the shadows of supply chains, in the corridors of central banks, and in the quiet routing of energy pipelines. The West thinks in terms of battles, the East thinks in terms of logistics. While Washington is obsessed with where to park its aircraft carriers, Beijing is quietly securing the choke points of the global economy. This asymmetry is devastating because it bypasses the United States' traditional strengths. What good is the world's most advanced stealth fighter if you cannot source the gallium and germanium required for its radar systems? What is the value of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier if the industrial base required to maintain it has been outsourced to the very nations you are trying to contain? We are witnessing a masterclass in reciprocal escalation. The United States escalates militarily with base expansions in the Philippines, with nuclear submarine deals in Australia, with arms sales to Taiwan. In response, the Eurasian powers escalate economically and asymmetrically. They do not need to sink a U.S. carrier to win. They simply need to deny the U.S. economy the resources it needs to function. Russia has already demonstrated this with energy, bringing European industry to a grinding halt by turning off the gas tap. Now, China is signaling it can do the same with the technology sector. The soft blockade is a warning shot at the jugular of Silicon Valley. It is a reminder that the digital age is built on physical minerals, and those minerals are overwhelmingly controlled by the rivals of the West. The geopolitical consequences of this standoff are radiating outward, destabilizing regions far beyond the Pacific. We are seeing a diplomatic mobilization of the global South that is unprecedented in modern history. This is the revolt of the non-aligned. Nations that were once vassals or silent observers are now active participants in the dismantling of the unipolar order. They see the United States distracted, fighting a two-front Cold War it cannot afford, and they smell blood in the water. Look at the Middle East. Traditional American allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are ignoring calls from the White House and are instead hosting summits with Chinese leadership, negotiating oil trade in yuan, and joining the BRICS alliance. They are hedging their bets. They understand that the security guarantee of the United States is a depreciating asset. They look at the radar lock incident not as an act of Chinese aggression, but as proof that the U.S. can no longer dictate the rules of engagement in Asia. If the U.S. cannot protect its own aircraft from being painted as targets, how can it protect the shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf? This loss of deterrence translates directly into a domestic nightmare for the American citizen. The establishment tries to compartmentalize these issues, telling the public that foreign policy is separate from domestic policy. This is a lie. The inability of the U.S. to manage these two fronts, Europe and Asia, is the direct cause of the inflation, eating away at your savings. When supply chains fracture because of geopolitical tension, prices rise. When the government prints trillions of dollars to fund proxy wars on two continents, the currency is debased. The national security that the politicians speak of is crumbling, not because of a lack of walls, but because the economic foundation of the nation is being sacrificed on the altar of global hegemony. We are importing instability. The panic in the defense sector, the frantic rush to secure titanium and enriched uranium, is a signal that the U.S. military-industrial complex is realizing it is trapped in a resource cage of its own making. The ultimate danger here is the miscalculation that arises from desperation. As the economic noose tightens and the diplomatic isolation grows, the United States is becoming more unpredictable, not less. The asymmetric warfare being waged against it is designed to provoke a reaction, to lure the dying empire into a trap where it overcommits and collapses under its own weight. The radar lock was a test of discipline. Did the Japanese pilot fire? No. Did the U.S. scramble a strike package? No. They froze. They froze because they know that any kinetic response triggers a cascade of events they cannot control. They are realizing that they are no longer the player moving the chess pieces. They are merely reacting to the moves of a grandmaster. This is the new reality of the 21st century, a world where the United States is just one of several great powers, struggling to maintain a sphere of influence that is rapidly shrinking. The global reckoning is not coming, it is here. It is in the price of gas, it is in the fragility of the stock market, and it is in the terrified silence of a pilot realizing he has been marked for death by a superior force he was told to ignore. We stand now in the twilight of empire. The long shadows are stretching across the Potomac, darkening the marble monuments of a capital that has lost touch with the world it claims to lead. The incident in the East China Sea, the radar lock, the blockade, the silent strangulation of supply lines is not merely a tactical escalation. It is a historical inflection point. It marks the moment when the irresistible force of a rising multipolar world finally collided with the immovable object of American hubris. For the better part of a century, the United States has operated under the delusion that it is the protagonist of history, the indispensable nation without whom the world would descend into darkness. But as the lights flicker in Europe and the war drums beat in Asia, we are discovering that the world is perfectly capable of spinning without Washington's permission. The sun is setting on the American century, not because of a lack of strength, but because of a lack of wisdom. The establishment has spent its inheritance on foreign adventures and neglected the foundation of its own house. Washington now faces a binary choice, a decision that will determine the trajectory of the 21st century. It is the choice between adaptation and annihilation. The first path requires a quality that has been entirely absent from American foreign policy for generations: humility. It requires the United States to accept that it is no longer the hegemon, but merely one great power among many. It requires the acceptance of spheres of influence, the acknowledgement that Russia has security interests in Europe and China has security interests in Asia. It means abandoning the messianic crusade to remake the world in America's image and retreating to a policy of realism and restraint. It means fixing the bridges in Ohio before building bases in Okinawa. It means saving the dollar by balancing the budget, rather than weaponizing it until it becomes worthless. This path offers survival. It offers a chance to remain a prosperous, powerful, and respected nation, albeit one that shares the stage with others. The second path is the path of illusion. It is the path currently being walked by the neoconservatives and the liberal interventionists who infest the State Department. It is the refusal to accept reality. It is the belief that if they just yell loud enough, sanction hard enough, and ship enough missiles, the timeline will revert to 1991. This path leads to ruin. It leads to a two-front war that the United States cannot win, a conflict that will shatter the global economy, destroy the value of the currency, and potentially end in a nuclear exchange. The radar lock on the Japanese jet was a final warning from reality to the illusionists. It was the universe telling them that their map no longer matches the territory. If they continue to sail the ship of state into these waters, fueled by the fumes of nostalgia and the arrogance of past victories, they will crash against the rocks of the new order. The myth of American exceptionalism has been a powerful drug. It convinced a nation that the laws of history, the laws of imperial overstretch, of debt, of demographic decline did not apply to them. It allowed them to believe they could print infinite money without inflation and fight infinite wars without exhaustion. But the withdrawal symptoms are now setting in. The shaking hands of the leadership, the incoherent strategy, the panic over a soft blockade. These are the signs of an addict realizing the supply is cut off. The rest of the world has already moved on. The BRICS nations are building a lifeboat while the Titanic steams toward the iceberg. They are creating a parallel system, a world where trade is conducted in gold and commodities, not in promises and threats. The United States is being left behind. isolated in its own echo chamber, screaming commands that no one obeys. The ultimate tragedy is that this decline was optional. It was chosen. It was chosen every time a president decided to topple a secular dictator instead of building a factory. It was chosen every time Congress voted to send billions to a foreign border while leaving their own open. And now the bill has come due. The second front is not just a military problem, it is the verdict of history. The radar lock has broken the spell. The blockade has closed the door. The American era is over. The reality era has begun. The only question that remains is whether the United States has the grace to accept its new place in the world, or if it will burn the house down trying to prove it is still the master. If you want to understand the hidden mechanisms of this collapse and prepare yourself for the multipolar reality that the mainstream media refuses to show you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I will continue to expose the uncomfortable truths that the establishment wants to keep buried. Question 1. Do you believe the United States has the industrial capacity to fight a war in the Pacific? Or is the military reliance on Chinese supply chains the ultimate strategic checkmate? Question 2. If the US dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency due to these geopolitical blunders, what do you think will happen to the standard of living in the West within the next 5 years?